Today on the Perception in Action podcast, my interview with Sian Beilock from Barnard College. Why does pressure affect different performers in different ways? What should be in your toolbox when preparing for a high-pressure situation or recovering from a situation where you didn't handle pressure as well as you would have liked? How can we best train to prevent choking? So it's time for a call to action. Hello, and thanks for joining me. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. If you're a coach or an instructor, my goal is to help you bridge the gap between research and application, and to connect your experiential knowledge with skill acquisition and motor learning theory. I want to help take you from using practice design recipes to becoming a master chef who can manipulate the key ingredients to come up with your own innovative training methods. If you're a student or fellow academic working in the skill acquisition field, I hope to keep you up to date on the latest studies and help you get to know the people working in this area. Finally, if you're developing training technologies, I hope to help you incorporate good motor learning principles in your design, pull out key performance metrics from the data, and design effective studies to evaluate your product. To learn more, help support the podcast, and or work directly with me, please check out perceptionaction.com. Now on to the show. In today's episode, I had a great time catching up with Sian Beilock, my former collaborator and now president of Barnard College. As most people know, Sian is one of the world's leading experts on the topic of choking under pressure in sports. Her book, Choke, is essential reading in this area. In the interview, we discussed topics including why some athletes choke and others don't, when the skill focus and distraction explanations of choking might apply, how the current environment of sports might provide its own unique pressures, the yips, and how to best prepare to excel under pressure. Hope you enjoy. All right, today my guest is Sian Beilock from Barnard. Thanks for joining me, Sian. It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you, Rob.
So today I just wanted to kind of throw at you a random barrage of questions about choking under pressure, something most people know you've studied really, really well and written about. And so I guess to start with, I know you were a very accomplished athlete yourself. Do you have a moment that inspired you to go this direction or something, an event, a particular thing?
Yeah, so I definitely started this because I was interested in doing me-search, not just research. And I played soccer in the Olympic Development Program, and I was a goalie, and I had in high school the worst game of my career in front of the national coach. And that always stuck with me. I wondered, why I didn't perform at my best in the situation where I wanted to perform well. And I knew it wasn't about my skill, because I could certainly save things in practice that I missed in the game. So it really pushed me to ask this question about what changes in the head, essentially, when we're motivated to succeed. And sometimes we just don't.
Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting. I find that's a common theme about me search. I like that. I had a similar thing. Mine was almost the opposite at the end of my hockey career. I had trouble making teams because I kind of couldn't get myself up for the tryouts. Like maybe because hockey goal, you get hurt a lot when you get hit with the puck, but I don't know. So I want to dive into some of the research. One of the questions I've seen people kind of raise recently, and I think it's a fair one, is kind of how do you think what you might call underperformance under pressure, being a little bit off, kind of relates to the catastrophic failure of choking? Are those the same thing on a continuum? What can we infer from one to the other? Have you thought about, sometimes people have accused, making a putt slightly longer is maybe underperformance rather than choking. Have you thought about that, Al?
Yeah, I tend to think about choking as really significant performance drops relative to, what one is used to performing. And I think, we all have performance ups and downs. So that can be independent of one's surroundings or what's going on. Certainly, if you have consistent underperformance in pressure-filled situations, I think it could be a form of choking, but I do think it's something, I think it would be interesting to study the difference there, if it's a different mechanism, so to speak.
Yeah. I think it's a matter of degree, but you do probably fall off a cliff somewhere there. And
I think we've all had that experience, right? Or seen people have that experience where it's, things are a little bit off versus really just going blank or playing completely differently than you would otherwise. And I think, it's a tricky problem because you have to figure out how to define the difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could call it, anything underperformance when there's something on the line is choking, but certainly there's degrees of it.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting one.
Yeah, and I know people have said that you need to attach the psychological component to it. You can't be just defined by performance. You need the anxiety side. The other, so when you started to get into this research, I often tell people that I was interested in doing sports science for a long time, but coming from a experimental psychology background, I looked at the field and I went, nope, at first, because it was very loose, I found, from my perspective, methodologically. Then I discovered work of people like Bruce Abernathy and yours and Tom's work where here's how you can do it a little more rigorously. So how did you come up with the idea of, using dual tasks, there's kind of this trade-off between studying something real and control of the lab. How did you kind of dive into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. Well, I did a dual PhD, so in kinesiology and psychology. So, I was always interested in choking writ large, not necessarily in sports specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that actually helped to better define some of the phenomenon that we were studying, right? And so then you could ask questions. Does this look different in different domains or with people with different skills? Does choking look different from a mechanistic perspective in terms of what happens in the brain and body if you're holding a golf club versus a pencil?
Mm-hmm.
Should that matter? And I think it gives you this ability then to ask questions across areas and connect the research. I think one of the issues that, we've talked about before, but I think is often true in the sports science world is it's, where it isn't as strong as it could be is when it's not connected to the greater psychological research, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that I think is a really important aspect of doing good science.
Yeah, I think so. There's so much there. It's almost a shame to kind of ignore it.
Or do it in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Right? And it goes both ways. I mean, I recently just reviewed a paper where they were looking at choking, and it was from a neuroscientific perspective, and they hadn't connected it to the sports literature.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think it really goes both ways. And the more we can kind of break down those barriers between disciplines that are asking similar things,
mm-hmm.
The better.
Yeah, no, I agree. And you kind of hit on it there. I like your quote, the pencil versus, I can't remember what sport, baseball bat. I'll say a golf club. So those are the two, so there's these two very dominant theories of why we choke. I like to call them the turning towards or turning away theories, because there's a bunch of them in each category. I know you've tried to look at both of them, and so what is are both involved? What is your latest thinking on when one might apply over the other?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the brain behaves that differently whether you're holding a pencil or a golf club. I think, how a skill is represented in memory really affects what will lead to better versus worse performance. And I think, my hypothesis has been worries about the situation, about its consequences, and then this sort of tendency to focus on what you're doing are always both going on at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just depends on what you're doing in terms of how that plays out. So if I'm doing something that is running largely outside of conscious awareness, then it doesn't matter if I'm worried about the situation or its consequences. What matters is when I try and control what I'm doing and turn inward.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm doing something that requires me to juggle numbers in my head, it's not really going to matter if I turn inward. But if I start trying to do two things at once and also think about how the person is doing on the test sitting next to me, that could be a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to think of it. And I know people have tried to put all this into one story, but it is a tricky thing. So related to that, I think a question a lot of people have raised is kind of the really interesting one is the individual differences in choking. Why some people are susceptible to another. And I know this gets into a lot of the other work you've done on like math performance and things. I think you found some of the things that seem to relate to that. So what are your thoughts on kind of why some people choke and others don't?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think the fact that we haven't studied individual differences more is sort of a product of the people that are studying choking, right? I mean, like in experimental psychology, you tend to study group averages, and in sports, kind of the same thing, right? And so I think that there's probably more of an individual difference perspective that could be really interesting to take a look at that we haven't yet. I mean, we know some things like people who tend to be really self-conscious might be more prone to turn inward. And certainly if you have a fear about a particular area, something I've worked a lot in is math, and especially it tends to be true more for women and girls, you can certainly choke because you're worried about it. But, I think there's so many unanswered questions about early experiences choking and individual differences in people who tend to perform poorly in pressure situations across every domain they undertake versus some people who excel in sports when the pressure is on and then fall on their face when they're taking a test. Like, what's different from them versus someone who performs poorly in all these situations?
Yeah. No, I agree.
So I don't have an answer. I just think it's interesting.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's a really, you're right. It doesn't fit well with the standard approach we use to studying things, right? Putting everybody in group and finding the average.
Right. But I will say that I think one thing that my research group and I have looked a lot lately is this sort of tendency to be worried about being evaluated based on who you are in a way that's negative, right? So, we talk about it as evaluative apprehension, and whether you're the only woman on a team or you're, the first from your school to play, in a new league, anything where you're worried about being undervalued can be really stress inducing. And I think that's an interesting individual difference just based on a person in the situation that we haven't looked enough at.
Yeah, no, I think I just finished one of my PhD students did on coaches, basketball coaches, especially looking at women and black coaches, kind of how their opportunity often they represent the whole of their group. If they fail, they're probably not going to get another chance. So that's kind of
that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah,
right. And I think that happened. And one thing we know is that how you perceive a situation can be dependent on the assumptions you bring in. And if you're worried that everyone's judging you based on a particular characteristic, I mean, that's pressure in itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Kind of related to that. I kind of, in my pressure, in the work I did, I always followed kind of your example. And I used what I like to call the kitchen sink approach to just throw everything you can think of, right? To get the people under get feeling. But have you kind of thought about teasing apart like competitive pressure where you put a prize on the line versus social kind of evaluated versus what do you think are the differences there?
Yeah, we haven't done that. I mean, I think there are some researchers that have done that and looked at, different sorts of monetary awards, whether it's like $1 versus 50, that might make a difference. I guess I was never as interested in sort of what specific kind of pressure was causing choking, just because I think that it's so individual in the real world. Like I'm more interested in why and how it happens and then what we can do to fix it. Although, I mean, certainly it's an interesting line of study, but, I was in real world situations, like you can choke in any sort of situation, right? When you're stuck in an elevator and you have to impress someone for 30 seconds versus trying to parallel park while your friends watch, to calculating the bill on the tip on a bill when you're at dinner. And so I always focus less on what was making people choke and more why they were choking and how to fix it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's fair. I think, especially in sports, you're probably going to have all of these things there most of the time anyway. So, another one I wanted to ask you is about kind of this unique, you've probably been asked this multiple times recently, but this unique situation athletes are in now, playing in front of no fans at all, or on a neutral ground or small number of fans. Do you think, is there any kind of unique twist this puts on, the choking idea?
Yeah, you're right. I've, lots of people have asked me this lately. I think it's really fascinating, right? And I'm hoping someone's doing research on it. We're not, but I hope someone is. I think, one thing you could make all sorts of arguments, right? That it's not that some athletes rely on the crowd to sort of get amped up, right? And so you could have this constant underperformance just because they're not there in the same way, or it takes the pressure off. And, I think part of it is sort of getting used to whatever situation you're playing in. And I think we saw a lot of this, or as much as we could, in terms of getting people into bubbles or getting them used to playing without the fans, because it's a new and different situation. But I also think there was a really low bar for success this year in most sports, which also takes the pressure off. I mean, just completing a season is amazing.
Yeah. Fielding a team was kind of a win. Yeah.
Yeah. But, one thing I heard from some players, like in hockey, was that, they ended up getting more amped up by their own teammates, right? They look to their teammates as more of an audience. So you kind of create your audience wherever you are. In interesting ways.
Yeah.
And I think, high-level athletes have made their careers adapting, right? They're there because they can adapt to particular situations. And I find it so interesting.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think it's I think you're right. I've seen a bunch of things, in baseball. I think they showed the home field advantage was greater this year than it's been in like 10 years, even though there's no fans. And I've seen lots of post hoc explanations. I think there's a million. There's some weird things like in baseball, when you have a man on base and you throw over to first to keep them close, when there's fans there, they get mad at you because it's slow and boring. But there's lots of ways it can change people's behavior, not having a crowd, other than kind of the traditional, they're putting pressure on. Yeah. So I think it's a really complicated, interesting question. I agree. I hope some people are analyzing it too. So, and so I guess the $1 million question, right, out of all this is how you help athletes perform better under pressure. And I know you've looked at, again, in both in the sports context and then in the test taking context, you've looked at a variety of different things. What's kind of your ideas on that now?
Yeah, I mean, I think in my book Choke that I wrote, I give like a toolbox basically of techniques, and because I think it's not one size fits all. And when I work with professional athletes or other individuals, it's about trying out what tools that work. I mean, I think a really important one that we don't give enough credit to is getting used to whatever situation you're going to perform under. So, somewhat akin to practicing without fans, if you're going to be without fans, practicing under stress. And I think we don't do that enough. Whether it's penalty shots where no one's watching, which isn't very stressful, to taking tests, that are untimed when you have to take a really timed test, to giving a talk and doing it just in front of yourself instead of in front of other people. There's something that's, really powerful about getting used to those kinds of situations you're going to have to perform under. And so I talk a lot about that. Like, how are you practicing, or, and I talk a lot about this idea that you're closing the gap between training and competition. Like, how are you practicing under the actual kinds of conditions you're going to perform under? And giving talks is, I think, the biggest one. Like, do you videotape yourself? Do you do it in front of other people? Because it's very nerve-wracking when you're up in front of a crowd versus when no one's watching you. It's a fundamentally different skill, I would argue, in many ways.
Yeah. No, I agree. I see the same thing. You mentioned penalty kicks, and sometimes I see, sometimes you have more time to in a competitive situation, and people don't practice what to do with that time. Like, I've seen lots of teams practice soccer penalty kicks without that long walk you have to do from center field to the line is hugely important what you do there, right? Obviously what you think about. and they don't often practice that. So I think that's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, I mean, also, I think there's a lot of things you can do before you get into the situation. So if you've had a failure in the past, are you practicing reframing it, right? Rather than dwelling on it and what you lost, who you let down, are you changing how you think about it the next time, in terms of what you're all of a sudden bringing to the table, in terms of the one thing you're going to change? I mean, we know that when we get in this sort of state of oh crap, what's going on? I'm really worried. We can see in the brain that our brain acts differently. And we know that a lot of that happens before we get into the penalty kick or to take the math test. So how are you controlling your mind off the pitch or off the field?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know in your math work, right, you've found that writing about your worries and stuff and anxiety has helped well. Do you think that would work in sports? It's obviously, there's a tricky thing that it's kind of seen as a weakness, right, to kind of express these by a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much work showing the power of journaling in general, like for sort of offloading negative thoughts, for sort of reorienting you just to focus forward. And it's fortunately something you can do and no one has to know about. But I do think there's a lot of work in terms of in neuroscience and psychology, showing that we don't have to be prey to our thoughts and feelings. Like we can actually help shape our outlook. Mm-hmm. And it's something you can practice and something you can learn, whether it's meditation or journaling or, reaffirming the qualities of yourself that are important and positive. Like these things actually change how the brain functions. And we have evidence of that. So I'm and I mean, it could be even anything even more simple than that in terms of some pre-game ritual. Like I'm a big fan of whatever gets you in the mind state that's going to allow you to perform better.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's fair. I think you have to have a plan for that. I think is the key. And yeah, maybe the last question I just thought of myself. I get asked a lot about the yips. We've seen it. It actually saw it in the baseball playoffs this year. Jose Altuve had, so if the people that don't know, it's the athlete losing ability to perform a really routine play usually when they have lots of time, right? How do you connect the yips to choking in your mind? And this is a super difficult question I find for me and what to do about it. But I was wondering your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think oftentimes people talk about kind of two versions of what the yips are. One is sort of a biomechanical or a change in the motor patterns, and another could be more influenced by the psychology of what you're thinking about. And they can go together, right? I mean, I think they often do. And so I think oftentimes the way to deal with that sort of biomechanical change is to actually change how you're performing, like change the biomechanics of it. I mean, that's been shown, for example, in the golf world, changing actually how you putt has been shown to be one way to sort of reset those motor patterns. And so sometimes I think just focusing on the psychology is not enough. It has to go hand in hand with something that's motoric. So that's how I think about it. Yeah. What about you?
Yeah, kind of the same thing. I think it is kind of fundamentally a different thing in a way. You can point to a lot of the same, it seems to have a lot of the similarities, right? The fact that when you given a really quick, difficult play, you usually have no problem. Suggests there's some psychological, probably attentional. But yeah, I agree with you. I think you have to tackle it differently. Get at the actual movement. Changing. I know in golf, like changing to a different type of putter sometimes, helps. Yeah. So, but I think that's.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, and it goes back to this toolbox, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, for some people, it might be just making sure they do things quickly or changing the time they have to dwell. But for others, you might have to go right to the actual motion and the movement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. That my experience too is some, stop thinking about that. For some people, that's easier than others. You have to do smaller steps for other people. Yeah. I guess very last question. We mentioned before we went recording, you mentioned, you have obviously don't have as much time for research now, but if you get slowly getting back into it, are you going to continue to study in this area? What ideas are you thinking about?
Yeah, so I'm doing a lot of work right now in Chicago and in New York, looking at math learning and anxiety. I've been focused on that. And one thing that I'm really interested in is how people who are anxious about either a high pressure athletic situation or a math test or a math class, how they actually practice. And so we're doing a lot of work right now looking at how people practice depending on how worried they are about what's going on. And we know we like to do things that make us happy and feel good. So we tend not to practice things that are uncomfortable. And we have data, for example, with people who are really worried about math, showing that when they're getting ready for a math test, they tend not to do as many practice problems because those make you uncomfortable. They're harder. So you just sort of read over the book and then it turns out you're not as prepared, right? So then the question is, what's choking and what's not being prepared? And I think these are really interesting questions that could play out in the sports world as well, right? If you are worried about those free throws or that high pressure, putt on the 18th hole, are you less likely to practice the kinds of things that are going to make you uncomfortable to get you ready? And are you already sort of setting yourself up for failure?
Yeah. I like that. I think that's really good. You mentioned taking this full circle. You mentioned like keeping in context of other research. It makes me think of like Janet Stark's work, and I know you work with her well. Mm-hmm. Wonderful work on like history practice, what people actually practice, what say they're going to practice kind of work. So I think that would be
right. And what's uncomfortable to do.
Yeah.
And I think we're at a point in our world where we are often tending to shy away from things that make us uncomfortable and confrontational and just talk to each other who think like us and do things like us. And, I think that might be the worst thing. So if we can figure out how to help people practice better, why not?
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks, Sian. That was really great. It was great talking to you.
Oh, it was fun to do this, Rob.
Thanks again for the great discussion, Sian. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.